The Christmas lights twinkled softly outside, casting a warm glow on the snow-dusted windows of Spring Manor. Inside apartment 24, a different kind of light had gone out. Grocery bags sat half unpacked on the dining room table. In the kitchen, a young woman lay still. A butcher knife, her own kitchen knife, plunged into her neck. Around its wooden handle, meticulously wrapped, was a simple dish towel. On December 5, 1975, in Manor Township, Pennsylvania, the life of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Biechler was violently extinguished. Her murder was as baffling as it was brutal, leaving behind a community in shock and a trail of questions that would haunt generations. Was she chosen at random, or was something far more sinister at play? A lurking presence she'd sensed just weeks before. Before we dive deeper, tell us in the comments below, where are you watching from today? Now let's step back into that cold December evening. The gentle snowfall that began to descend upon Manor Township, Pennsylvania, on the afternoon of December 5, 1975, seemed to promise a tranquil lead-up to the holidays. Christmas lights, strung with care, flickered merrily in the windows of the Spring Manor apartment complex, painting a cozy, festive facade against the growing dusk. For most, it was merely another Friday nearing its close, a day of routines and quiet anticipation. But for Lindy Sue Biechler, a vibrant 19-year-old, this particular December day would mark the abrupt and brutal end of her burgeoning life. Lindy was a young woman on the cusp of everything. Married for just over a year to Philip Phil Biechler, she was navigating the early chapters of adulthood with the optimism characteristic of her age. Their modest apartment in Spring Manor was more than just a dwelling. It was their first home together, a foundation for the future they were eagerly building. As the evening approached, Lindy embarked on a commonplace errand, a quick trip to the local supermarket. The items on her list were likely mundane, perhaps ingredients for dinner, household necessities. She left the apartment around 6:45 p.m. The simple act, so ordinary, belied the horror that awaited her return. What transpired in the brief window between 6:45 p.m. and 7:05 p.m. that Friday evening remains shrouded in darkness. Lindy crossed the threshold of her apartment, likely laden with grocery bags, unaware that someone was either already inside, lying in wait, or had followed her, unseen, into the perceived sanctuary of her home. The minutes that followed were marked by an unimaginable terror, an act of savagery that would only be revealed much later, casting a long, cold shadow over the quiet community. At 8:46 p.m., as the night deepened and the snow continued its silent descent, Lindy's aunt, Celeste, and her husband arrived at apartment 24. A casual visit, perhaps to share coffee, or simply to check in on the young couple. Celeste knocked, a polite rap on the door, but received no answer. She called out Lindy's name. Only silence responded. A sense of unease began to stir, as she noted the door was unlatched. Pushing it gently open, Celeste stepped inside, her husband following close behind. The living room appeared undisturbed, a snapshot of everyday life momentarily paused. The supermarket bags Lindy had carried home sat on the dining room table, still mostly full, as if she had been interrupted in the midst of putting away her purchases. Celeste moved further into the apartment, her voice echoing faintly as she called out for her niece. Each step brought an increasing tension, the quiet amplifying the unspoken dread. She continued her search, her path leading inevitably toward the kitchen. The scream that tore from Celeste's throat ripped through the apartment's stillness, a sound that would reverberate through the memories of all involved for decades to come. Lindy Sue Biechler lay on the kitchen floor, sprawled on her back, fully clothed. But it was the object protruding from her neck that transformed the scene into a waking nightmare. A large butcher knife, unmistakably one of Lindy's own from the kitchen, was plunged deeply into her flesh. The wooden handle, grimly, was carefully wrapped in a dish towel, an unnerving detail suggesting either a killer's attempt to avoid leaving fingerprints or a need for a firmer grip during the brutal act. Barely able to function, Celeste stumbled back, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the telephone. The call to 911 was made, signaling the entry of law enforcement into a tragedy already hours old. When officers from the Manor Township Police Department arrived, followed shortly by investigators from the Lancaster County Detective Bureau, the scene they encountered was one of shocking brutality. The initial examination of Lindy's body revealed the horrific extent of the assault. She had not been stabbed merely once. She had been attacked 19 times. 19. The sheer number conveyed a narrative of intense rage, of something deeply personal or profoundly disturbed. The stab wounds targeted her neck, chest, upper abdomen, and back. Further inspection indicated that 2 different knives had been used in the attack, suggesting a prolonged and frenzied assault. The amount of blood saturating the kitchen floor was substantial, a testament to the violence unleashed. Amidst the crimson evidence, a distinct male footprint was observed, clearly left in the blood, and there was more. As investigators carefully examined Lindy's body and clothing, they discovered evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. Semen was meticulously recovered from her underwear, a critical piece of forensic evidence that in time would prove to be pivotal. News of the brutal murder of Lindy Sue Biechler exploded through the small, close-knit community of Manor Township, like a devastating shockwave. This was one of those places where faces were familiar, where crimes of such heinousness simply did not occur. The fabric of trust and safety was torn apart. Phil Biechler, Lindy's young husband, then a student at Millersville State College and working at a car rental agency, was informed that his wife of just over a year had been murdered in the most horrifying way possible, within the sanctuary of their own home. His anguish was palpable, raw, and visceral. As is standard procedure in nearly all homicide investigations, Phil Biechler automatically became the initial person of interest. Statistically, spouses are often the first suspects. However, Phil provided a rock-solid alibi. He had been at work at the time of the murder, a claim corroborated by multiple witnesses. His alibi was swiftly verified, and he was quickly eliminated as a suspect. With the most immediate and statistically probable suspect cleared, the investigation into Lindy Sue Biechler's murder was cast into a chilling sea of uncertainty from its very beginning. A young life had been taken with extreme violence, in plain sight, yet the killer had vanished, leaving behind only a trail of questions and a community gripped by fear. The gentle snowfall that began to descend upon Manor Township, Pennsylvania, on the afternoon of December 5, 1975, seemed to promise a tranquil lead-up to the holidays. Christmas lights, strung with care, flickered merrily in the windows of the Spring Manor apartment complex, painting a cozy, festive facade against the growing dusk. For most, it was merely another Friday nearing its close, a day of routines and quiet anticipation. But for Lindy Sue Biechler, a vibrant 19-year-old, this particular December day would mark the abrupt and brutal end of her burgeoning life. Lindy was a young woman on the cusp of everything. Married for just over a year to Phil Biechler, she was navigating the early chapters of adulthood with the optimism characteristic of her age. Their modest apartment in Spring Manor was more than just a dwelling. It was their first home together, a foundation for the future they were eagerly building. As the evening approached, Lindy embarked on a commonplace errand, a quick trip to the local supermarket. The items on her list were likely mundane, perhaps ingredients for dinner, household necessities. She left the apartment around 6:45 p.m. The simple act, so ordinary, belied the horror that awaited her return. What transpired in the brief window between 6:45 p.m. and 7:05 p.m. that Friday evening remains shrouded in darkness. Lindy crossed the threshold of her apartment, likely laden with grocery bags, unaware that someone was either already inside, lying in wait, or had followed her, unseen, into the perceived sanctuary of her home. The minutes that followed were marked by an unimaginable terror, an act of savagery that would only be revealed much later, casting a long, cold shadow over the quiet community. At 8:46 p.m., as the night deepened and the snow continued its silent descent, Lindy's aunt, Celeste, and her husband arrived at apartment 24. A casual visit, perhaps to share coffee, or simply to check in on the young couple. Celeste knocked, a polite rap on the door, but received no answer. She called out Lindy's name. Only silence responded. A sense of unease began to stir, as she noted the door was unlatched. Pushing it gently open, Celeste stepped inside, her husband following close behind. The living room appeared undisturbed, a snapshot of everyday life momentarily paused. The supermarket bags Lindy had carried home sat on the dining room table, still mostly full, as if she had been interrupted in the midst of putting away her purchases. Celeste moved further into the apartment, her voice echoing faintly as she called out for her niece. Each step brought an increasing tension, the quiet amplifying the unspoken dread. She continued her search, her path leading inevitably toward the kitchen. The scream that tore from Celeste's throat ripped through the apartment's stillness, a sound that would reverberate through the memories of all involved for decades to come. Lindy Sue Biechler lay on the kitchen floor, sprawled on her back, fully clothed. But it was the object protruding from her neck that transformed the scene into a waking nightmare. A large butcher knife, unmistakably one of Lindy's own from the kitchen, was plunged deeply into her flesh. The wooden handle, grimly, was carefully wrapped in a dish towel, an unnerving detail suggesting either a killer's attempt to avoid leaving fingerprints or a need for a firmer grip during the brutal act. Barely able to function, Celeste stumbled back, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the telephone. The call to 911 was made, signaling the entry of law enforcement into a tragedy already hours old. When officers from the Manor Township Police Department arrived, followed shortly by investigators from the Lancaster County Detective Bureau, the scene they encountered was one of shocking brutality. The initial examination of Lindy's body revealed the horrific extent of the assault. She had not been stabbed merely once. She had been attacked 19 times. 19. The sheer number conveyed a narrative of intense rage, of something deeply personal or profoundly disturbed. The stab wounds targeted her neck, chest, upper abdomen, and back. Further inspection indicated that 2 different knives had been used in the attack, suggesting a prolonged and frenzied assault. The amount of blood saturating the kitchen floor was substantial, a testament to the violence unleashed. Amidst the crimson evidence, a distinct male footprint was observed, clearly left in the blood. And there was more. As investigators carefully examined Lindy's body and clothing, they discovered evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. Semen was meticulously recovered from her underwear, a critical piece of forensic evidence that, in time, would prove to be pivotal. News of the brutal murder of Lindy Sue Biechler exploded through the small, close-knit community of Manor Township like a devastating shockwave. This was one of those places where faces were familiar, where crimes of such heinousness simply did not occur. The fabric of trust and safety was torn apart. Phil Biechler, Lindy's young husband, then a student at Millersville State College and working at a car rental agency, was informed that his wife of just over a year had been murdered in the most horrifying way possible, within the sanctuary of their own home. His anguish was palpable, raw, and visceral. As is standard procedure in nearly all homicide investigations, Phil Biechler automatically became the initial person of interest. Statistically, spouses are often the first suspects. However, Phil provided a rock-solid alibi. He had been at work at the time of the murder, a claim corroborated by multiple witnesses. His alibi was swiftly verified, and he was quickly eliminated as a suspect. With the most immediate and statistically probable suspect cleared, the investigation into Lindy Sue Biechler's murder was cast into a chilling sea of uncertainty from its very beginning. A young life had been taken with extreme violence in plain sight, yet the killer had vanished, leaving behind only a trail of questions and a community gripped by fear. The immediate shock that rippled through Manor Township quickly solidified into a concentrated and urgent investigative effort. The Lancaster County District Attorney's Office, in conjunction with the Manor Township Police Department, wasted no time in assembling a dedicated task force. Their primary mandate was unambiguous: identify and apprehend Lindy Sue Biechler's killer with the utmost speed. Detectives, many of whom were accustomed to the relatively low crime rates of rural Pennsylvania, suddenly found themselves grappling with a crime of unprecedented brutality and baffling anonymity. The sheer savagery of the act, within a seemingly safe residential complex, underscored the urgency and gravity of their mission. Investigators meticulously scoured the Spring Manor apartment complex, specifically Lindy's unit, documenting every minute detail of the crime scene. They worked tirelessly to preserve any and all evidence that could be collected and analyzed with the forensic capabilities available in 1975. The first crucial step was to cast a wide net into the community. Door-to-door inquiries began immediately across the apartment complex and surrounding areas. Neighbors were questioned exhaustively, asked about anything unusual they might have seen, heard, or observed on the evening of December 5th. Every person who had even the most tangential connection to Lindy, friends, acquaintances, co-workers, distant relatives, became a potential source of information. The early days following the murder were a whirlwind of interviews, phone calls, and constant activity at the police precinct. Leads were pursued no matter how faint, and every statement was carefully recorded, cross-referenced, and analyzed. By February 1976, a mere 2 months after the murder shattered the community's peace, investigators had conducted interviews with an astonishing number of individuals, estimated to be between 250 and 300 people. Despite this exhaustive, almost relentless effort, and the considerable resources poured into the case, no concrete leads materialized. The sheer volume of collected information did not translate into a clear, identifiable path toward the killer. The perpetrator remained a phantom, eluding every attempt at identification. Among the myriad statements and anecdotal observations collected during this intense period, one particular detail emerged, though its ultimate relevance remained frustratingly elusive. A witness reported seeing a dark-colored standard American sedan double-parked near the Spring Manor complex. The vehicle was noted to have been there for an extended period, between 7 p.m. and 8:40 p.m., with its headlights reportedly on. Such an anomaly, a car idling conspicuously in a quiet residential area during the evening hours, might normally pique significant curiosity. However, despite intense follow-up investigations, including checking local vehicle registrations and canvassing area residents for any familiarity with the car, no one was able to definitively identify the vehicle or its owner. It remained a phantom detail, a potential clue hanging frustratingly in the air, without any solid substance to ground it. This lack of identification only deepened the frustration of the investigators, highlighting the elusive nature of the case. As the relentless investigation wore on, a deeply disturbing piece of information surfaced from Lindy's close circle, casting a chilling new light on the circumstances of her death. In the weeks preceding her murder, Lindy had confided in her husband Phil and other family members that she had been experiencing an unsettling sensation. She felt as though someone was watching her. She couldn't articulate exactly why she felt this way, or identify who the observer might be, but the persistent feeling of being observed, of unseen eyes upon her, was distinctly unnerving. At the time she voiced these concerns, Phil, perhaps out of a desire to reassure her, or simply not grasping the gravity, had not attached significant importance to her worries. He might have reasoned it was merely a fleeting insecurity or a touch of paranoia. But now, with Lindy brutally murdered in her own home, those hushed words took on a macabre and chilling weight. Had Lindy's instincts been tragically accurate? Was her killer not a random assailant, but rather someone who had deliberately chosen her, meticulously stalking her, patiently waiting for the opportune moment to strike? This chilling revelation deepened the mystery surrounding the crime, suggesting a premeditated personal dimension to the act, yet still offering no identifiable suspect to pursue. Just 3 months after Lindy's murder plunged Manor Township into fear. In March 1976, another shocking and violent crime rattled the nearby region. 43-year-old Mary Shinzing was found stabbed to death in her home in Columbia, Pennsylvania, a town located only a few miles from Manor Township. The similarities between the two cases were immediately striking and deeply unsettling to investigators. Both women had been victims of multiple stab wounds. Both crimes displayed extreme violence, and both occurred within the sanctity of a domestic setting. Detectives cautiously began to explore the possibility of a connection, fearing that a serial killer might be operating in Lancaster County, preying on women in their homes. However, this alarming line of inquiry was soon definitively resolved. Kenneth Dale Arndt, then 33 years old, was swiftly apprehended, charged and subsequently convicted for Mary Shinzing's murder. Following Arndt's arrest, a thorough and detailed comparison of the forensic evidence and circumstances of both cases led police to a conclusive determination. He was not involved in Lindy Biechler's death. The cases were officially deemed separate, a brutal and unsettling coincidence of timing and method. This crucial distinction, while bringing a measure of closure to the Shinzing family, only served to further isolate Lindy's case, emphasizing its unique, unsolved mystery and leaving investigators back at square one, confronting a singularly baffling crime. Despite the tireless efforts of the task force and the initial fervent activity, the promising leads eventually dwindled, and the initial surge of investigative momentum began to wane. Lindy Sue Biechler's case, slowly but inexorably, began its descent into the category of a cold case. The limitations of forensic technology in 1975 proved to be an almost insurmountable barrier. DNA analysis, the revolutionary tool that would fundamentally transform criminal investigations, was still decades away from widespread application, existing largely in the realm of theoretical science fiction. While fingerprints were diligently collected from the crime scene, they yielded no matches in the existing, less comprehensive databases of the era. The male footprint found in the blood, though a stark piece of evidence, was too generic in its characteristics to provide any definitive identification of a suspect. Most significantly, the semen sample meticulously recovered from Lindy's underwear, a critical piece of biological evidence, could be preserved, but in 1975 there was simply no established scientific method to use it, to identify a specific individual without a direct suspect against whom to compare it. Without a named individual to cross-reference, this powerful piece of evidence remained a silent, dormant clue, locked away in storage, awaiting a future that had not yet arrived. The case file, thick with interviews and reports, remained officially open, a somber testament to justice unfulfilled, but active investigative movement eventually ceased. The absence of actionable leads allowed the killer to disappear back into the anonymity from which they seemingly emerged. Years stretched into a desolate procession, but the searing pain of Lindy's senseless loss and the gnawing frustration of unanswered questions remained a constant heavy burden for her family. Phil Biechler, her young widower, valiantly attempted to rebuild his shattered life, eventually remarrying and seeking some semblance of normalcy. But the chilling shadow of that December night never fully lifted. For Lindy's mother, Eleanor Giese, the injustice of her daughter's unsolved murder was a daily torment, a prayer for justice that seemed eternally unanswered. Then, in December 1976, precisely a year after the murder, a new and profoundly cruel layer was added to their suffering. Lindy's family visited her grave at Boehm's United Methodist Church in Manor Township, only to discover a shocking act of desecration. Her headstone had been vandalized with red spray paint, and the stone itself was chipped and scratched, defiling her final resting place. The act was a callous and inexplicable assault on their grief, meticulously observed to have occurred sometime since late November. Who would commit such an abhorrent act and why? It was a disturbing, deeply personal escalation of their torment, seemingly designed to prolong their anguish. Adding to the family's profound distress, in January 1977, just weeks after the discovery of the grave vandalism, the police department received a chilling anonymous letter. Marked prominently with the word urgent, the letter was purportedly written as if from the man who had not only stabbed Lindy Sue Biechler, but also desecrated her grave. The contents were disturbing, filled with details only the killer would know or claim to know. However, after a thorough analysis of its language, handwriting, and general tone, police investigators ultimately concluded it was a cruel hoax. They believed it was likely penned by a disturbed individual seeking attention or notoriety, perhaps someone with an unhealthy fascination with the crime. Consequently, they made the difficult and calculated decision not to publicize the letter. Their fear was that making its contents public might encourage copycats, inspire other disturbed individuals, or perhaps most importantly, further traumatize the already suffering Biechler family. This suppression meant that another potential, albeit twisted and unreliable, piece of the puzzle was dismissed from public knowledge. Both the family and the investigators were left feeling trapped in a labyrinth of pain, unanswered questions, and frustrating dead ends. The killer remained free, a ghost haunting the community, and the truth, obscured by layers of time and the limitations of contemporary evidence, seemed ever more tragically unreachable. The chilling anonymous letter received in January 1977, though ultimately dismissed as a cruel hoax by investigators, cast a final, frustrating pall over the early stages of Lindy Sue Biechler's murder investigation. With no concrete leads, no identifiable suspect, and the inherent limitations of 1970s forensic technology, the once feverish case slowly, agonizingly, began its descent into the realm of cold cases. The dedicated task force, initially brimming with determination, gradually saw its members redeployed to more active cases, or over the passage of time, retire from service, carrying the unresolved weight of Lindy's death with them. The extensive file, once a source of daily scrutiny, was meticulously archived, labeled cold, a heavy designation signifying an indefinite pause in active investigation. Yet despite being formally shelved, the case of Lindy Sue Biechler was never truly forgotten. It persisted as a haunting, persistent shadow over Lancaster County, a stark and constant reminder of justice unserved, a wound that refused to heal. Over the ensuing decades, the Lindy Sue Biechler case solidified its grim status as the oldest unsolved cold case in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. It became a solemn fixture in the annals of local law enforcement, a constant challenge for successive generations of detectives. Seasoned investigators, nearing the ends of their careers, would recount the harrowing details of that December night, their voices tinged with a quiet frustration at their inability to bring the killer to justice. Newer recruits inheriting the weighty yellowed case files would pore over reports from decades past, hoping to discover an overlooked detail, a forgotten nuance that might finally crack the impenetrable mystery. They would re-interview aging witnesses, whose memories had faded or shifted over time, and revisit the crime scene through photographs, mentally reconstructing the brutal events. Each attempt, each fresh look, was imbued with a renewed but often cautious hope. For Lindy's family, especially her mother Eleanor Giese, the relentless march of years was a protracted torment. Her unwavering prayers for justice, voiced nightly for decades, were sustained by a fragile hope, even as despair often threatened to engulf her. Phil Biechler, Lindy's young widower, valiantly attempted to forge a new life, eventually remarrying and seeking a degree of normalcy, but the chilling memory of that December night remained an indelible scar. The wider community, though moving forward with its own life and progress, never fully erased the memory of the vibrant young bride brutally taken in her own home. The case remained an open wound, a constant reminder of a perpetrator who had seemingly melted back into anonymity, enjoying a life unburdened by consequence. However, as the passage of time continued, the landscape of criminal investigation itself began to undergo a profound, almost revolutionary transformation, driven by relentless scientific advancements. While traditional investigative methods had reached their limitations in the mid-1970s, the frontiers of science continued to expand at an exponential rate. A crucial turning point for the Biechler case arrived in 1997, a full 22 years after Lindy's murder. The meticulously preserved semen sample, recovered from Lindy's underwear at the crime scene, a silent, biological witness held in secure storage for over 2 decades, was finally subjected to the burgeoning capabilities of DNA technology. This groundbreaking science, once relegated to theoretical discussions, was now becoming a powerful practical tool in forensics. Scientists were able to extract and analyze the genetic material, successfully developing a unique DNA profile of the unknown assailant. This was a monumental leap forward, a biological blueprint of the killer finally rendered visible. It was a moment of cautious optimism, a belief that science could finally provide the answers that traditional detective work could not. With this new, powerful genetic profile, hope, which had dwindled to a faint ember, flickered anew within the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office and among Lindy's family. In 2000, 3 years after the profile was generated, it was uploaded into CODIS, the National DNA Index System. CODIS, which stands for the Combined DNA Index System, was a rapidly expanding federal database developed by the FBI, designed to allow local, state, and national law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes against convicted offender profiles and other unsolved cases across the country. The act of submitting the profile was imbued with immense anticipation. Investigators in Lancaster County, the Biechler family, and the entire community held their breath, expecting, praying for, a hit, a match that would mean a name, a face, and finally, answers. The meticulous process of uploading the unique genetic signature into the vast digital repository was a testament to the persistent hope for resolution. However, the system returned nothing. The killer's DNA profile was not present in the database. He was not a known offender whose genetic information was on file. The profound disappointment of a non-match was a crushing blow, returning the case to its cold, stagnant state, leaving the DNA profile as a powerful yet frustratingly mute piece of evidence. It was as if another door had been slammed shut, leaving everyone once again facing a blank wall. Despite the technological marvel that had created the profile, then nearly 2 decades later, a new and even more groundbreaking scientific methodology began to emerge, promising to unlock the secrets held within those silent DNA strands, even without a direct CODIS match. This was the advent of forensic genetic genealogy. This innovative approach leveraged the rapidly expanding public databases used by individuals seeking to trace their ancestry through DNA submitted to commercial companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Millions of people, curious about their ethnic origins and family histories, were unwittingly creating a massive, publicly accessible repository of genetic information that could be harnessed for other, unintended purposes. The world took notice in 2018 when the notorious Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, responsible for a terrifying reign of terror that spanned decades across California, was finally apprehended. His capture after more than 40 years was achieved by comparing DNA from his crime scenes to these public genealogy profiles, leading investigators to distant relatives and, ultimately, through painstaking genealogical work, to him. The methodology involved building reverse family trees, tracing ancestral lines back through generations to pinpoint common ancestors, and then working forward through those branches to narrow down the pool of potential suspects. The significance of this breakthrough was not lost on law enforcement nationwide. It validated a new powerful tool in the arsenal against cold cases. The news of D'Angelo's capture reverberated powerfully through law enforcement agencies across the country, and a distinct spark of renewed hope ignited within the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office. Here finally was a potential, albeit unconventional, path forward for the seemingly intractable Biechler case, an opportunity to re-examine their oldest cold case with fresh eyes and revolutionary tools. In September 2019, seizing this nascent possibility, authorities formally requested the services of Parabon Nanolabs, a leading company specializing in forensic DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy. Their initial task was a cautious foray into the new technology to create composite sketches of the suspect. These sketches were not based on faded witness recollections, but directly on the DNA profile recovered from Lindy's crime scene. This innovative DNA phenotyping aimed to predict the suspect's physical traits, such as hair color, eye color, skin tone, and facial structure, purely from his genetic code. The resulting sketches, depicting how the killer might have looked at age 25, around the time of the murder, and at age 65, his approximate age in 2019, offered the first true face to the unknown assailant in over 4 decades. This tangible, albeit estimated, visual representation was shared with the public and media, generating renewed interest and a fresh wave of hope that someone might recognize the face from the past or present. It was a significant step, moving beyond mere numbers to a more human, albeit projected, image. However, the real turning point, the decisive leap of faith, arrived in December 2020, 45 long years after Lindy's murder. The Lancaster County District Attorney, after careful deliberation, recognizing both the potential and the unprecedented nature of the endeavor, made a pivotal decision to go beyond mere composite sketches. They requested Parabon Nanolabs to proceed with a full genetic genealogy analysis. This was a substantial investment, requiring significant resources and a willingness to embrace a still-developing forensic science. Crucially, they specifically contracted C.C. Moore, a highly respected and pioneering genetic genealogist. Moore had earned a formidable reputation for her instrumental role in solving numerous high-profile cold cases across the country using these very revolutionary techniques. She was precisely the expert needed to navigate the intricate labyrinth of genetic data and historical genealogical records. The DNA profile of Lindy's killer, once a silent enigma, then a mere pattern of numbers, was now placed into the hands of a specialist who possessed the unique skill set to make it speak. This bold commitment marked a new era in the arduous, decades-long quest for justice for Lindy Sue Biechler, injecting renewed purpose and a final, desperate hope into a case that had resisted resolution for far too long. The stage was now set for science to confront a cold case that had haunted Lancaster County for nearly half a century. The decision by the Lancaster County District Attorney in December 2020 to fully embrace forensic genetic genealogy marked a pivotal, almost desperate, turning point in the decades-long pursuit of justice for Lindy Sue Biechler. With this directive, the cold case, once shrouded in impenetrable mystery and resigned to the archives of the past, was officially entrusted to C.C. Moore. Moore was not a traditional detective, armed with badges and warrants, but a meticulous puzzle solver of genetics and history, operating primarily from a computer screen, navigating a vast network of online databases, and leveraging an encyclopedic knowledge of genealogical research methodologies. Her expertise lay in making the silent speak, in drawing connections across generations that traditional police work could never uncover. Moore's Herculean task began with the DNA profile of Lindy's killer, a complex sequence of genetic markers that, for years, had represented an unidentifiable phantom, a silent witness unable to name its perpetrator. Her methodology was precise, painstaking, and revolutionary, a true testament to the evolution of forensic science. She took this anonymous DNA profile and uploaded it to public genealogy databases. These platforms, populated by millions of individuals curious about their personal ancestry, functioned by comparing users' submitted DNA to identify shared genetic segments, thereby revealing familial connections ranging from close relatives to distant cousins. The objective was not to find a direct, immediate match to the killer, as had been attempted unsuccessfully with CODIS, but rather to identify distant family members, individuals who might be third, fourth, fifth cousins, or even more remote relations, who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for recreational genealogical purposes. Each shared segment of DNA, quantified in units called centimorgans, served as an invaluable breadcrumb, pointing back to a common ancestor, a distant familial nexus shared by the killer and his unwitting relatives in the database. From these initial, often very distant genetic matches, C.C. Moore embarked on the arduous process of constructing a reverse family tree. This involved working backward through generations, meticulously piecing together ancestral lines for each identified relative. She would then painstakingly compare these individual trees, often stretching back hundreds of years, searching for points where they converged, identifying common ancestors from whom the killer and his distant relatives would have inherited their shared DNA. It was akin to sifting through countless grains of sand to find the precise common origin point for several disparate piles. This monumental task required not just unparalleled genetic expertise, but also profound genealogical knowledge, demanding cross-referencing of myriad public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, census data, obituaries, gravestone inscriptions, military records, and property deeds, often spanning centuries and multiple continents. Each piece of public record, each newly verified branch on the ever-growing tree, brought her incrementally closer to a potential family line that could contain the killer. The process was a test of patience and intellectual rigor, a slow, methodical grind, but the anchoring power of DNA made it possible to navigate the labyrinthine complexities of human lineage. A pivotal and breathtaking breakthrough emerged from this meticulous research, transforming the trajectory of the investigation. The DNA analysis, combined with Moore's genealogical reconstructions, indicated with remarkable specificity that all four of the killer's grandparents originated from a particular town in Italy named Gasparina. This was far from a vague Italian ancestry. It was a precise geographical pinpoint, an almost unheard-of level of specificity that in the world of genetic genealogy instantly registered as a gold standard clue. This strong genetic concentration suggested a family line with limited intermarriage outside of this specific region, effectively simplifying the subsequent genealogical search by significantly narrowing the geographical and genetic variables. This discovery immediately focused Moore's efforts, providing a critical geographical and cultural context to her complex genetic data, allowing her to target her research with unprecedented precision. Armed with this powerful new insight, C.C. Moore pivoted her research, embarking on a deep dive into the historical immigration patterns from Gasparina, Italy, specifically to the United States, and more precisely to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where Lindy's murder had tragically occurred. She scoured vast digital archives of immigration manifests, ship passenger lists, and naturalization records, diligently tracing families who had made the arduous journey from this specific Italian town to settle in the United States. Her research extended to local historical societies, seeking out old family histories and community records. She delved into decades-old newspaper archives for announcements, obituaries, and social mentions, and she examined judicial records from the mid-20th century, searching for any documentation that could illuminate the lives of these immigrant families once they established roots in Lancaster. She was looking for individuals who matched the broad genetic profile, whose family lines included ancestors originating from Gasparina, and who would have been definitively present in the Lancaster area around 1975, the year of Lindy's murder. This systematic, multi-pronged approach allowed her to compile a comprehensive, albeit still extensive, list of Italian families residing in Lancaster in 1975 who had demonstrable ancestral connections to Gasparina. The next, excruciatingly detailed phase involved a painstaking process of elimination. Moore methodically worked through her carefully curated list of potential candidates, cross-referencing each name against known details from the crime. She considered the age range of the likely perpetrator, early 20s in 1975, their exact geographical proximity to Spring Manor, and any other known historical or familial data. She applied filters based on age, gender, residence history, and family composition, attempting to find any individual who stood out as a strong candidate. Many names were discarded as inconsistent with the established evidence, too young, too old, or simply not present in the right place at the critical time. It was a monumental task of sifting through dozens, then scores, then hundreds of individuals, gradually narrowing the field of possibilities with each carefully verified piece of information. The pressure was immense. Every elimination brought her closer to the truth, and every remaining name carried the weight of a potential killer, until, finally, after months of relentless and intricate work, a single name emerged with an almost shocking clarity, standing out from all others on her carefully constructed list: David Vincent Sinopoli. The name, once just another entry in a genealogical chart, now pulsed with a chilling significance, when investigators, guided by C.C. Moore's unparalleled research and the stark clarity of her findings, began to delve into the life of David Sinopoli. The fragmented pieces of this decades-old, brutal puzzle began to fall into place with disturbing precision. David Sinopoli was indeed in his early 20s in 1975, an age perfectly compatible with the general profile of the assailant derived from the DNA evidence. More strikingly, and confirming Moore's crucial genetic discovery, all four of his grandparents were precisely from Gasparina, Italy, providing a direct and powerful corroboration. But the most unsettling and chilling revelation, the detail that sent a cold shiver through the investigative team, was yet to come. David Vincent Sinopoli had lived in the very same 4-unit building within the Spring Manor apartment complex where Lindy Sue Biechler resided. He was her neighbor. He lived just doors away, sharing the same walls, the same communal spaces, as the young woman he would brutally murder. The perpetrator of Lancaster County's oldest cold case had not been a distant stranger, a phantom from afar, but a hauntingly close, intimate presence, living in the immediate vicinity of his victim. This revelation fundamentally shifted the perception of the crime, transforming it from a potentially random act into something far more personal and premeditated, rooted in proximity and opportunity. After the murder, David Sinopoli did not vanish into the night, nor did he flee the area. Instead, he continued to live in Lancaster County for decades, seemingly untouched by the horrific crime committed just meters from his own apartment. He married, starting a family and having children, 3 in total, 2 from a previous marriage and 1 with his current wife. He pursued a career as a printer in a commercial printing company, working diligently, contributing to society, living a life that outwardly appeared to be utterly unremarkable, completely devoid of suspicion. For 36 years he maintained this flawless facade, blending seamlessly into the community, raising his children, all while the case of his neighbor's murder remained tragically unsolved, a file gathering dust in police archives. He walked free, built a family, and lived a seemingly ordinary existence while Lindy Sue Biechler's family endured an unending purgatory of grief, unanswered questions, and a profound sense of injustice. The stark irony and the profound moral chasm between his public life and his hidden past were almost unfathomable. By February 2022, investigators had a prime suspect, a name that genetic genealogy had painstakingly unearthed. However, suspicion, even when backed by revolutionary genetic genealogy, was not the same as legal proof. To move forward with an arrest and secure a conviction, they needed a direct corroborating DNA sample from David Sinopoli himself. This sample would then be compared to the original DNA evidence from Lindy's underwear, providing the irrefutable, scientifically sound link necessary for prosecution in a court of law. But they couldn't simply approach him and request a sample. Doing so would immediately alert him to their suspicions, potentially causing him to flee, destroy any remaining evidence, or create legal complications that could jeopardize the entire long-fought investigation. The element of surprise, the integrity of the evidence, and the meticulous legal process were paramount. Therefore, a new covert phase of the investigation began, one focused on patience, strategy, and meticulous round-the-clock observation. The stage was now set for a tense and critical operation, obtaining David Sinopoli's DNA surreptitiously, without his knowledge, to finally confirm his identity as Lindy's killer and close a case that had haunted Lancaster County for nearly half a century. The revelation that David Vincent Sinopoli, a man who had lived an ordinary life for decades, was not only the genetic match to Lindy Sue Biechler's killer, but had also been her neighbor in Spring Manor, plunged the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office into a new critical phase of the investigation. While the genetic genealogy provided an incredibly strong lead, it was not in itself sufficient for a legal arrest and conviction. To ensure an ironclad case, investigators needed a direct, verifiable DNA sample from Sinopoli, collected in a manner that would stand up to the most rigorous scrutiny in court. The challenge was immense. How to obtain this crucial evidence without alerting a man who had successfully hidden his secret for over 46 years, allowing him to potentially flee, destroy evidence, or hire legal counsel that could complicate the pursuit of justice. The answer lay in meticulous, discreet surveillance. For weeks, a dedicated team of investigators from the Lancaster County Detective Bureau placed David Sinopoli under an intensive, round-the-clock watch. Their mission was one of unwavering patience and strategic observation. Detectives shadowed his daily routine, his trips to work as a commercial printer, his visits to local shops, his social engagements. They tracked his movements with stealth and precision, blending into the background, becoming unnoticeable figures in his periphery. Every aspect of his life was observed, every pattern noted, as they patiently waited for the perfect, innocuous opportunity. A moment when Sinopoli would unknowingly discard an item containing his DNA, an item that could then be legally collected as abandoned property. The stakes were incredibly high. One misstep, one moment of carelessness, could compromise the entire long-fought investigation and allow Lindy's killer to slip away forever. The tension among the surveillance team was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of nearly half a century of unanswered prayers resting on their shoulders. That opportunity arrived on the cold, pre-dawn morning of February 11, 2022. David Sinopoli, accompanied by his wife and another couple, was at Terminal A of Philadelphia International Airport, awaiting an early morning flight. The airport, a bustling nexus of transient humanity, offered the perfect cover of anonymity. Sinopoli and his companions made their way to a coffee shop. In a moment so utterly mundane that it would typically be forgotten seconds later, David Sinopoli purchased a coffee. Detectives, seamlessly integrated into the throng of travelers, observed from a discreet distance, their gazes unwavering, their hearts pounding with a quiet anticipation. They watched as Sinopoli sipped his coffee, engaged in conversation with his group, completely oblivious to the silent, watchful eyes that held his fate. Then, as millions of people do every day without a second thought, he casually discarded the empty coffee cup into a nearby trash receptacle. It was a fleeting, insignificant action for him, but for the investigators, it was the culmination of weeks of painstaking surveillance and the defining moment they had been waiting for. As soon as Sinopoli and his group moved away, heading towards their boarding gate, the detectives sprang into action. Without drawing attention, they swiftly approached the trash can. With practiced ease, they retrieved the discarded coffee cup. Inside, around the rim and on the lid, lay the precious biological evidence they needed: Sinopoli's saliva, carrying his unique DNA. The cup, now transformed from a piece of refuse into a critical piece of forensic evidence, was carefully packaged, meticulously preserved, and immediately dispatched for laboratory analysis. The analysis of the DNA from the coffee cup was not a straightforward comparison. The sample was a touch DNA sample, potentially a mixture of genetic material from Sinopoli and other individuals who might have handled or touched the cup. To ensure the highest level of accuracy and to isolate Sinopoli's unique profile from any potential contaminants, the sample was sent to Cybergenetics, a specialized laboratory in Pittsburgh, renowned for its expertise in separating and interpreting complex DNA mixtures using advanced probabilistic genotyping software. Their scientists worked with meticulous precision, employing cutting-edge techniques to deconvolute the mixed sample and definitively isolate the genetic profile belonging to David Sinopoli. Every step of this process was documented with rigorous detail, anticipating the inevitable scrutiny of a courtroom. The tension within the investigative team reached its apex in April 2022. The results from Cybergenetics arrived. The DNA profile meticulously extracted from the discarded coffee cup was an unequivocal, irrefutable match to the semen sample found on Lindy Sue Biechler's underwear back in 1975. The statistical probability of this match was staggering, approximately 10 trillion to 1. 10 trillion. Such a figure conveyed a level of scientific certainty that left no room for doubt. For the investigators who had dedicated years, even decades, to this case, it was a moment of profound relief, a scientific affirmation of what they had begun to suspect. The phantom killer finally had a name, and his genetic signature had unequivocally linked him to the crime. To further bolster the already overwhelming evidence, investigators went a step further. They consulted a blood spatter expert to meticulously re-examine Lindy's clothing, particularly her pantyhose, which had been worn at the time of the attack. The expert identified 2 specific bloodstains on the exposed portion of the pantyhose, consistent with having been left by the assailant during the brutal attack. These additional samples were also sent for DNA testing. The results provided yet another confirmation. The blood found on Lindy's clothing also matched the genetic profile of David Sinopoli. The circle of evidence was now complete and unbreakable. The murderer was David Sinopoli. On Sunday, July 17, 2022, a staggering 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days after Lindy Sue Biechler's life was brutally taken, detectives from Lancaster County arrived at David Sinopoli's home on Faulkner Drive. He still lived in Lancaster, the same community where he had carried his dark secret for nearly half a century. They knocked on the door. David Sinopoli, then 68 years old, answered. He was informed that he was being arrested for the murder of Lindy Sue Biechler. The arrest was without incident. He offered no resistance. His long-held secret finally laid bare. The following day, Monday, July 18, 2022, Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams held an emotional press conference. Standing before a room packed with media and with Lindy's still grieving family in attendance, Adams delivered the long-awaited news. Lindy Sue Biechler was 19 years old when her life was brutally taken from her 46 years ago in the sanctuary of her own home, Adams declared, her voice heavy with the weight of the moment. This arrest marks the beginning of the criminal process in Lancaster County's oldest cold case homicide, and we hope it brings some sense of relief to the victim's loved ones and community members who, for the past 46 years, have had no answers. She emphasized that the case was solved through the pioneering use of DNA genetic genealogy, specifically thanking C.C. Moore and Parabon Nanolabs for their revolutionary work. It was a moment of profound significance, a triumph of persistence and scientific innovation. For over a year, David Sinopoli's case wound its way through the intricate corridors of the judicial system. And then, on October 19, 2023, David Sinopoli, now 69 years old, entered a Lancaster County courtroom. He stood before Judge David Ashworth, surrounded by the 2 fractured worlds his actions had created, members of Lindy's family on one side, bearing decades of grief, and his own family reeling from the sudden, devastating exposure of his hidden past on the other. In a moment many had thought would never come, Sinopoli made a pivotal declaration. He pleaded guilty. He admitted guilt to third-degree murder, to aggravated assault and to burglary. Acknowledging the terror he had inflicted, Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson prosecuted the case. During the emotional sentencing hearing, she pointed to a photograph of Lindy, displayed prominently in the courtroom next to Sinopoli. These cases are never forgotten. Lindy Sue will never be forgotten, Wilson asserted, her voice echoing the collective memory of the community. While the defendant was able to go on with his life, Lindy was extinguished by him. "Look at her," Wilson commanded the defendant, her finger still directed at the young woman's image. "And the precious life you stole in 1975. Members of Lindy's family read victim impact statements, their voices trembling with decades of suppressed pain. They spoke of how her senseless death had impacted their lives for nearly 5 decades, the void she left, the joy that was stolen. Phil Biechler, Lindy's widower, now remarried and having attempted to move forward, was present. 48 years after losing Lindy, he finally had a name, a face, and a confession from the man who had shattered his young life. Lindy's mother, Eleanor Giese, who had prayed every night for justice, saw her prayers answered. "My God, perhaps it will come," she had said before the arrest, a fragile hope now realized. Sinopoli's family was also in court, their faces etched with a different kind of pain. His wife, married to him for decades, had lived beside a killer, completely unaware of the monstrous secret he harbored. Sinopoli's defense attorney, Alan Sodomski, acknowledged the immense suffering of the Biechler family, but also noted the profound anguish of his own client's family. "My client's family is suffering as well, suffering greatly," Sodomski stated. "And I don't know how people recover from this, but this question has weighed heavily on my mind." Judge Ashworth's sentencing was unequivocal and without mercy for the defendant. He looked directly at Sinopoli, his words clear and firm. "You chose to viciously stab Lindy Sue Biechler 19 times and then defile her to satisfy your own selfish sexual desires. The enormity of the pain, suffering and damage you caused is incomprehensible," Ashworth continued, dismantling any pretense of remorse. "Make no mistake, you did not suddenly develop a pang of conscience. Come forward and take responsibility for your actions. You are not here today because you wanted to provide closure for Mrs. Biechler's family and friends. I have seen nothing in your conduct or your words that suggest you are truly remorseful for what you did." David Vincent Sinopoli was sentenced to a term of 25 to 50 years in prison. At 69 years old at the time of sentencing, Judge Ashworth acknowledged that this was, in essence, a life sentence. He would almost certainly die behind bars. The story of Lindy Sue Biechler is a stark, enduring reminder that justice, though often painfully slow, does not have to be impossible. It is a testament to the profound power of evolving technology, which can, decades later, finally give voice to the dead and bring a measure of peace to the living. It is a story of incredible persistence, of investigators who refused to give up, of a family who never stopped hoping for answers, and of a community that never truly forgot. And perhaps most remarkably, it is a story about how a simple coffee cup, casually discarded into an airport trash bin on a cold February morning, could carry the weight of a secret guarded for 46 years, a secret that finally was revealed. Lindy Sue Biechler, after decades of silence, finally had her voice back, and her killer was brought to account. For nearly half a century, the brutal murder of Lindy Sue Biechler cast a chilling pall over Lancaster County, an open wound in the fabric of a peaceful community. The initial fervent search for answers faded into decades of cold silence, a case file gathering dust while a killer walked free, living an unremarkable life. Yet the quiet prayers of a grieving mother and the unwavering dedication of investigators ensured Lindy's memory never truly dimmed. In the end, it was not a sudden confession or a forgotten eyewitness, but the relentless march of science, harnessed by the meticulous craft of genetic genealogy, that finally pierced the veil of time. A discarded coffee cup, an everyday object, became the silent messenger, its genetic code speaking volumes across generations, leading to David Vincent Sinopoli, a man who had been Lindy's neighbor all along. His eventual guilty plea and life sentence closed a chapter of profound injustice, an echo from 1975 finally reaching resolution in 2023. Lindy Sue Biechler's story stands as a testament to the enduring, often circuitous path of justice. It reminds us that even when the darkness seems impenetrable and hope a fragile whisper, the truth possesses an inherent resilience capable of emerging from the deepest shadows. It is a powerful reflection on human persistence, on the quiet suffering of those left behind, and on the transformative power of innovation to reconcile the past with the present, offering solace where none seemed possible. The passage of time may obscure, but it cannot ultimately erase. What aspect of this remarkable journey to justice resonates most deeply with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to After the Silence for more stories from the shadows. Your support helps us bring these untold narratives to light.